Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss Foxcatcher, starring Steve Carell, Channing Tatum, Mark Ruffalo, Anthony Michael Hall, Vanessa Redgrave, Guy Boyd, and Sienna Miller, directed by Bennett Miller. No relation there. Now, I remember going to theaters for this thing, being very impressed with it, and why is that? Let's get into the movie and I will explain. We open with some images of horses that belong to John DuPont, played in a powerful role by Steve Carell, as well as a fox catching game. And then we move on to the year 1987 with Mark Schultz, played by Channing Tatum, practicing wrestling and stopping by his school to show his medal that he won in an Olympic ceremony for wrestling at the school. Almost writes a check for $20 for his brother David. The school does. David is played by Mark Ruffalo, but Mark says it's for him. And I like Channing Tatum in this movie, but unfortunately, he's going to get robbed by Steve Carell and Mark Ruffalo as far as his performance is concerned. But he was good in this movie, as he goes to the gym to stretch and train with David as a wrestler. And remember, brothers do wrestle with each other in life, like the way these guys do. And Mark Ruffalo was very good in this movie, as his second best performance in the movie, in my opinion. David drives Mark home, and Mark gets a call from an assistant of John DuPont saying he wants to meet with Mark, and makes flight with arrangements for Mark to meet with John as his house in Pennsylvania. And the cinematography and makes this movie look great, as Pennsylvania looks gorgeous. As Mark meets John with some tremendous makeup on him, as it looks nothing like Steve Carell, and that's the best performance in the movie, in my opinion. We know of, and David doesn't look anything like Mark Ruffalo, and this house is beautiful, as John wants to recruit Mark for the 1988 Olympics, or 87, I forget which one it is, I think it was 87, now I'm thinking about it, as he wants to be his coach, and the dialogue is written by, very well done. Mark asks David for his brother and his wife, as well as his wife Nancy, played by Sienna Miller, and the kids to come with Mark to Pennsylvania, as David can't come for his family reasons, while Mark moves there on his own and gets to the house and meets Harry Beck, who interviews Mark until John gets in, and director Bennett Miller does a fantastic job with this movie, as he had a vision, and I was shocked this wasn't nominated for Best Picture of the Year of 2015. Fred Cole moves Mark in a house that John owns and gives him the tour, as Mark watches the TV about the DuPonts, and nighttime comes, and John wakes Mark up to check up on him while John is in a suit, and the morning comes, and they walk in the forest and train with some trainers, and Mark meets John in the office and asks Mark about David, as John wants to move David to Pennsylvania, but Mark says he can't, and Mark jogs in the forest, and there are great shots throughout this movie, even in the forest. Mark sees his mother briefly, Jean, played briefly by Vanessa Redgrave, training some horses while Mark and John fly to France with his first wrestling tournament. And Mark says he doesn't want to let John down, as John watches the match along with David, and Mark wins the match, while David has the next match, in which John also watches as he wrestles, and I'm guessing a Korean man, and David wins that match too, and Mark introduces John to David, and his family in an awkward moment, and Mark makes it even more awkward by telling Nancy she did not have a second to come up and say hello, even though it was from the distance, as Mark made himself look like an ass. And another tournament match with Mark comes on, as he wins that match as well, and they have a drink of champagne with Mark and his team. What's his team called? Team Foxcatcher, which explains the title of the movie. And John makes a speech about the animals on his farm, as well as his mother, and the acting in that scene was very incredible. Steve Carell is incredible in this movie. Mark Ruffalo is very good in this movie as well, and Channing Tatum does a good job with his performance as well. John pretends to fall and have a wrestling game with the trainers, and John, as well as Mark, and the next day comes, and John, as well as some police officers, practice shooting their guns in a distance, And John comes in firing a gun inside the gym and says, "Let's have a great workout," which seems frightening, while John gives Mark a $10,000 check and talks about how David and Mark want to distance themselves from his brother. And John wants Mark to call him either Eagle, Iron Eagle, Coach, or John, which is great writing as well as acted by Steve Carell and Channing Tatum. While John gets a tank without a gun, and they train as Mark models with John and fly in a helicopter with the city at a party and prepares a speech from Mark. And this is when John becomes manipulative to Mark, and makes Mark do cocaine, which really makes me fucking nervous, as well as the story. And the story is well told in a wrestler's point of view. Mark and John get to the party and meet some people and makes a speech to introduce John to the stage. And they get back home by helicopter, and next day comes and David calls Mark as Mark is taking a break by drinking some beer and hangs up the phone as nighttime comes, and Mark gets awakened by John to practice wrestling. And we come back to today, and Mark gives John a haircut. And we see Mark taking some cocaine, and that's John taking advantage of him. And he explains about his only friend growing up named Hubie. And Mark explains how David was his friend growing up. And we see John doing some wrestling himself, and at his age, he needs to retire the sport as this movie is well shot, as this movie is well made too. Mark has become someone else entirely, while Jean has a word with John showing her the new gold medal, and they talk what to do, what the train said, and he had grown up, and says he doesn't care what she does with them, and says she doesn't care about how she doesn't like wrestling as it's a low sport, and doesn't want to see John low. And John sees nobody in the gym and gave them, and what's his name? Mark gives them in the morning off and asks for David, and John slaps Mark as he gets abusive towards Mark and says it's a mistake bringing Mark to the team Foxcatcher. As John calls David behind Mark's back, and David comes in and brings his family to replace Mark with David, wanting to see Mark, as David is worried about Mark as he doesn't join the other guys in training. And Mark doesn't talk to John as he leaves the room after giving him a pep talk, and ignores his brother as well, while he doesn't want anything to do with them. And these were very heartbreaking scenes. Jean comes in the room with her mind while John is coaching, and he brings up the 1988 Olympics for the United States of America, and shows a couple of moves that works for John as John leaves the room. And we move on to the 1988 Olympics in Pensacola, Florida. And Mark has a match that was pretty damn sloppy, as he loses the match on purpose. And Mark is doing so on purpose, like I said, so he can humiliate John, and punches his own head and breaks the mirror as well as the TV set in his hotel room, for a bad performance. And he starts eating and treating himself horribly, and that was pretty damn sad in my opinion. David comes into Mark's room and slaps him to pull himself together, while Mark is very upset and tries to lose 12 pounds in 90 minutes to get him back in shape, as Mark is upset with John. As he comes back in, David talking with John and telling him to back off from Mark, and he comes back out with another wrestling match, and eventually Mark wins the match. And David talks with Henry about an uncomfortable moment they had earlier, as his mother died while he was out of town and flew back home early because of the sudden death, and lets all the horses go into the wild, as he doesn't want them, nor does he ever want them anyways. And John tests out the guns in his office, and John is becoming manipulative as Mark and David realize John is becoming an asshole, but not the typical over-the-top character Steve Carell plays in general. John comes to the gym and walks up to Mark, and David and Mark refuse to listen and talk to John, while John goes on the TV and Mark talks with David, telling him he doesn't want to be in the team Foxcatcher anymore. and decides to leave, as David does eventually get on an interview for the TV about John DuPont as a mentor. And since David is more on Mark's side, more than John's, while he wants Mark to get paid and to be treated like family in Team Foxcatcher, and John reluctantly agrees, and Mark had no choice but to agree to have John by his side despite he's not thrilled with it, as he was because he was manipulating him in the first place. And I'm enjoying this movie at this point as a wrestling movie. In the 1988 Olympics in Japan, Mark has a match and unfortunately loses the match, and when they get back, they have an extra security at the house, and Mark decides to leave the Team Foxcatcher for good, but David sticks around with John along with his family, and we move on to a day where it has snowed, and John watches the documentary as he feels disgraced by David. To a point, he comes by the house and points a gun at David and kills him and drives away, and the cops go look for him, and they find John and arrest him, and Mark gets in a match in the MMA, I'm guessing is what it is, and is about to get for a match as the movie ends, and the climax was sad, as it's not a wrestling movie like the WWE. And if that's the case, this movie isn't for you. But if you wrestled like this in high school and college, then this is the movie for you, despite it's really sad, but it's a really good movie at the end of the day. And I'll explain why in a rating. I'll give this movie a 8.4 out of 10. Steve Carell and Mark Ruffalo have the best performances in this movie, in my opinion, as Carell is incredible in this, and Ruffalo is very good as well, and Channing Tatum does a good job in his role and the dialogue is written very well done, while the cinematography in this is great to look at, as there's so many fantastic shots throughout the movie. The makeup is tremendous, as John doesn't look anything like the Steve Carell we know of, while David doesn't look anything like the Mark Ruffalo we know of, and director Bennett Miller does a fantastic job with this movie, as he had a vision, and I was shocked this wasn't nominated for Best Picture of the Year of 2015, as this is such a tremendous movie. The story is well told in a wrestler's point of view, but if you want to watch a movie about wrestling, say in the WWE, this isn't the movie for you. Or if you wrestled in high school or college like this is the movie for those people, as I'm going to give this a solid recommendation. And the relationship with the characters are great throughout the movie with some fantastic performances. And at the end of the day, it's a very good movie. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me for this review. And until then, 1, 2, 3, wrestle!